Welcome to the first research colloquium of fall 2020. We have two presenters. First presenter is Dr. Sergio Alvarez, who is presenting the economic impact of tropical cyclones on mature destinations, Florida. Please give him a warm welcome. And Sergio, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Valeria. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you guys see my first slide? It's a black slide with 3 photos on it. You can? Okay, great. So as Valeria mentioned, I am planning on speak on tropical cyclones today, but I wanted to start a little broader and give you sort of an idea of where I'm trying to get to with this research. It's a broader project, so let me just go ahead and jump on that. And again, my name is Sergio Alvarez, and I am an assistant professor with the Rosen College of Hospitality Management. To begin with, why am I focusing on coastal areas? To give you a short answer, coastal areas in planet Earth are extremely important. Our planet is on its surface covered by water around 70%. So 70% of the Earth's surface is water. Most people tend to congregate around coastal areas. So currently about 40% of global population lives in coastal areas. Coastal areas receive about half of all international inbound tourism. And when you look at photos of the night sky, you can see very clearly that most of human societies are really clustered around the coastlines. There are some exceptions. So for example, in Europe, there's a whole bunch of inland development. Same thing in China and India, in the Middle East, and in North America. But even in those areas, the coastlines are heavily populated. And this is true all throughout the world in basically every continent. So coastal areas are hugely important. And it is expected that they will continue growing in terms of population. So people are expected to keep moving into the coastal zone throughout the 21st century. And so what my research attempts to do is to answer some of these key questions that you see on the screen. So we are looking at different types of hazards. So it's not only tropical cyclones. Some of these hazards that you see on the screen are things that are catching our attention. So you have the harmful algae blooms that have been impacting the state of Florida recently, it seems with higher frequency and intensity. You have the dreaded coronavirus, cause of this pandemic that has us essentially living this remote lifestyle. Below you have fish kills from the Florida red tide, the Carenia brevis, which is another harmful algae bloom. And finally, the Vibrio bulnificus, which is a flesh-eating bacteria that is very common in Florida's coastlines and has been expanding to other places around the world. So again, some of the questions that we want to ask are, for example, how do different hazards impact a coastal destination? When you look at different hazards impacting the same destination, how are these impacts different? Similarly, when different destinations are impacted by the same type of hazard, are the impacts the same or are they different? And then finally, can we build a model or can we explain these differences in a systematic and quantitative framework so that we can essentially compare apples to apples when we're looking at different destinations and different hazards? To answer these questions, we're taking advantage of the fact that we live in the state of Florida. And really, the state of Florida is what I call a microcosm of global coastal issues. So really, when you think about the coastline in the 21st century, a lot of people are thinking about sea level rise. And this animation that you see on the right is, it's basically just a visualization of what is expected to happen over the 21st century in South Florida. And really, this is not a story that's unique to South Florida. This is something that is probably going to be happening throughout the planet. And so here, at least in South Florida, we have millions of people living in areas that are likely to experience heavy flooding just during high tide. So we're not even talking about storm surges, we're just talking about high tide. Again, this photo on the left is the storm surge map currently. So if there's a Category 5 hurricane, these areas in red would see about 9 feet of flooding. If the hurricane were to come in straight at that area. Also, like other coastal areas around the world, Florida is experiencing tremendous growth. Before the pandemic, people used to say, there's about 1,000 people moving to the state of Florida every single day. So all these problems really, are evident here in the state of Florida. And in addition to that, Florida is a really vibrant and diverse tourism destination. So Florida has really everything that coastal tourism has to offer. We have the theme parks, which is what Florida is perhaps best known for. But we also have culture. So we have museums, we have beaches, we have the nightlife that brings people to Florida from all over the place. And we also have sort of these more obscure destinations or more obscure attractions that less people know of. But so we have the springs, you can do cave diving in the springs, you have a lot of recreational fishing, and even the folks that like to do alligator wrestling, this is the place for them. So Florida is quite an eclectic destination. So for us, it gives us sort of this diversity and this richness of examples to study. So we take advantage of this diversity and the fact that Florida is what we would call in at least in the social sciences, a data-rich location. So we have, for example, a Department of Revenue here in the state of Florida that collects sales data on a county-by-county basis every single month for more than 80 economic sectors. And they have this data available publicly since at least 1995. So in essence, our methodology is we collected all this data, we put it into a panel that allows us to explore differences across counties and throughout time. We then find whatever data is available on the different types of hazards, and we develop time and space indicators to match the data, the economic panel data. And then we conduct econometric analysis to identify this relationship between the variation in sales and the occurrence of different hazards. And so right now we are working on 2 projects. The first is what I'll be talking about today, which is the tropical cyclones. And we have really a pretty great group working on this. So Christina Brown is a postdoc working for the Rosen College. Her background is in economics and geosciences. We have Dr. Arthur Huang, who is an engineer also working with the Rosen College. And we have Naveen Eluru, who is a professor in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Construction Engineer, and is very seasoned at using statistical models to tease out different kinds of effects in human behavior. Then the other thrust that we have right now is on the red tide harmful algae blooms. This is a project that is funded by the federal government, by NOAA, via GCUS. GCUS is the Gulf Coast Ocean Observing System. And so they awarded us a grant. And in this grant, we are working with Heather O'Leary, who is an anthropologist from USF, University of South Florida. Again, Christina, who is the postdoc, basically leading the charge, at least on the economic side of the project. And Frida Baja, who is a PhD student at the Rosen College. Okay, so let me just go in more detail on this project, identifying the economic impact of tropical cyclones in the state of Florida. And before I continue, I just want to give a shout out to, again, my co-authors, Christina, Naveen, and Arthur, who have been just fantastic at sort of bringing this to fruition. So much like the broader project, in this sort of sub-project focusing on the tropical cyclones, one of the things that we wanted to do was to develop a quantitative estimate of the losses essentially to the tourism industry that result from tropical cyclones. So we did not want to say, we know that the cyclones impact tourism in a negative way. We actually wanted to come up with a specific number that was backed by statistical analysis. So we want to find essentially the value lost by the tourism industry as a result of tropical cyclones. Beyond that, we also wanted to study the sort of the short and long-term impacts of the tropical cyclones. So we want to know, essentially, the tropical cyclone comes, how long is there a loss in sales? Is it just the month of the cyclone, or does it last several months? If there is a sort of a hit to the destination image after the tropical cyclone, we want to know how long does this hit last in general, and how big of a hit it is in terms of monetary losses. And then finally, we wanted to explore whether there's any differences between destinations that basically are in the coastline, that have a waterfront, and destinations that are inland and that don't have the waterfront feature. Are the impacts different in any way? So basically, to tell you a little bit more detail about what we did. So the Department of Revenue data has about 80 different economic sectors. And of these 80, there's about 6 that are clear sort of members of the tourism industry. And these are listed on the left of the screen here. So we have all different types of lodging. We have all kinds of restaurants and food establishments, bars and other types of eating and drinking places. We even have stores that sell food and beverages, so like grocery stores. We wanted to see if there was an impact on them as well. And everything that is related to rental of tangible properties, so car rentals, boat rentals, home rentals, all those kinds of things. Now, so we aggregated the data to just have the one tourism sector, basically an aggregation of these 6 sectors that you see here. And the data, it allows us to see some interesting features of tourism in Florida that may or may not come as a surprise to many of you. So for instance, we can identify the seasonality in tourism in Florida. Basically our high season is the winter time, and it probably doesn't come as a surprise to anybody. We have a lot of people who come from different locations in the United States and even Canada to essentially spend their winters down here. So essentially the high season is during the cold times. The peak of the tourism season in Florida coincides with spring break. So that is basically the highest point of the season. And then after that, it sort of cools down during the summertime. and then it picks up again during the winter. When you look at it over time, so this is the period of study. In this case, we're looking at data from 2009 to 2018. So 2009 was right after the Great Recession, where essentially tourism hit a throw. But then after that, it sort of has been or had been recovering pretty steadily until the pandemic began. So how do we, you already know how we collect the economic side of things. How do we develop this indicator of the tropical cyclones? So during this time period, from 2009 to 2018, the state of Florida was affected by 18 different tropical cyclones, which you see here on the screen. Essentially, every one of Florida's 67 counties experienced tropical storm force winds or higher at least once during this time period. So every one of our counties was impacted at some point. And really, we tried all kinds of things to, in developing this indicator. The first thing we wanted to try was to identify the impact via categorical variables. So we wanted to have essentially an indicator that would differentiate between tropical storms, hurricane category 1 and 2, and then major hurricanes. However, the data that we have been able to use from the National Weather Service is quite coarse in terms of the intensity of the hurricanes. So they give you the wind field for tropical storm or higher, and then they give you the wind field for hurricane winds or higher. And they are very similar, which is a big problem. So we ended up landing on a binary indicator that just takes a value of 1 if the county was impacted by tropical storm force winds or higher in the particular month that we are indicating, and 0 otherwise. So it's basically a dummy variable indicator. We developed this using GIS. So we essentially overlaid the wind swath with a map of the state of Florida with the different counties, and then we asked GIS to essentially construct this estimate. If the wind field was touching the county would get a 1. If it wasn't, the county would get a 0. In addition to that, we are also including lags. So we are not only indicating the month in which the tropical cyclone occurred, then we have essentially a system of lags going all the way to 6 months. We actually tried going all the way to 18 months, but the results between the models that have 18-month lags and 6-month lags are very similar. So we just simplified and kept the 6-month lags. So our specification in terms of the econometrics is relatively simple. So we have, we divided our sample into 3 groups. So one is the pool sample that has both the coastal counties and the inland counties. And then we estimated models for the coastal and inland counties separately. So we basically have 3 groups of counties that we look at. And then we take advantage of this panel nature of our model to run 3 different types of regressions. So we have a county fixed effects regression, where we are just controlling for variation across counties, but not across time. Then we have a county and time fixed effects model, where we have a control for the county and a different control for each specific time period. So for each combination of month and year. And then we have a random effects that doesn't really control for the variation there is no specific control for variation in counties or time periods. So as you can see, we just have our intercept, then our tropical cyclone indicator with the 6-month lags. We also have Florida's unemployment rate as a sort of as a control of macroeconomic variables, things in the in the broader economy that may impact the essentially the tourism economy. And these sort of Greek terms and letters are just our county and time fixed effects and our error structure. So to identify the best fitting model in each category, we ran a series of tests. So we essentially ran a bunch of tests to identify for each type of, for each subgroup of the data, which of these three models performs the best. So these are the results. So here is the pool sample. So this is all counties put together. And we found through our testing that the best fitting model is the one that controls for county and time fixed effects. We have also scaled our data so that the parameters that you see here, these are the impacts in millions of dollars. So for example, the month on average, whenever there is a tropical cyclone that hits a county, that county will experience a loss in these 6 sectors that I described earlier, combined, of about $10.14 million per month per county. On the month after the tropical cyclone, the impact actually is even higher. So on average, Florida's counties, on the month after they are impacted by a tropical cyclone, their sales will be about $12.23 million lower than normal. And this impact lasts all the way to the second month after the hurricane. So basically 3 months after landfall, you are still experiencing a loss in tourism as a result of the tropical cyclone of about $6.9 million. Graphically, you can see, so basically you're at 0 before the cyclone. On the month of the cyclone, there's a decline in your tourism sales. The month after the cyclone, that impact continues and even seems to get a little bit worse. And then there's, that recovery sort of begins, but there's still, a negative impact, at least compared to the average. And then you sort of go back to normality. So basically 1 to 3 months after the cyclone, you are still suffering as a whole in the state of Florida. When you look at the inland counties, just by themselves, so we identified the county fixed effects as the best fitting model. And so here, this is quite different, because on the month of the cyclone, when the cyclone hits the inland county, there is a negative impact of about $7.4 million on average. But then really that impact disappears. So it is not significant. The lack of the asterisk means that it's not significantly different from 0. But then when you get to 4 months after the hurricane, there's actually 2 months where there's a positive impact. So it's like a rebound effect that these counties, these inland counties experience, that really all of Florida does not experience as a whole. So again, graphically, you see, this is before the hurricane. The month of the hurricane, there's a big decline, and then it sort of gets back to normal. But then about 4 months, 4 and 5 after the hurricane, it's actually a positive impact, which is quite surprising. Now, when we look at the coastal counties just by themselves, we found that the county and time fixed effects is the model that performs the best. And here, the story is very similar to what we saw for all counties as a whole. So on the month that the cyclone hits, you have a loss on average of $12.5 million to the tourism economy per county. per month. On the month after the hurricane, this impact seems to sort of grow even more, to be even higher. So you have a loss of about $16.5 million. And then again, the recovery sort of begins at, but still experiencing a loss 2 months after the hurricane of about $9.7 million. And then you just sort of go back to normal, to not being significantly different from the average. So really what we see here is, or the way that we are interpreting this is, number one, there's this physical impact of hurricanes on the tourism industry in the month that the hurricane hits. So whenever the hurricane makes landfall, there's business closures, there's damage. You may have to close your businesses for a couple of days while while the storm is going on, and then while you're fixing things up and doing your repairs. If you have to rebuild, whatever you have to rebuild. So that happens on that first month. These are the physical impacts. Then there's what we call a reputation effect on the months, essentially the month after the hurricane and even 2 months after the hurricane. That is experienced only in coastal destinations. So only the coastal counties, the counties that have a waterfront, are experiencing this reputation effect. The counties that are inland, even though they also experience the hurricane, and in many cases the hurricane may be just as destructive, they do not seem to suffer from this reputation effect, from this, essentially from this negative impact on the destination's image. So again, just to recap, negative impacts in these cases measured as losses in tourism sales, tourism-related sales. They occur whenever there's a tropical cyclone in the short term. The impact is heavier in coastal counties, counties that have a waterfront. And we are thinking that maybe one of the reasons why the impacts are heavier, at least on the month of the hurricane, is because of this mandatory evacuation that may be more likely to happen in a waterfront destination, in a waterfront county, but less so on the inland counties. The inland counties usually go on voluntary evacuations, very rarely on mandatory evacuations. Again, coastal counties will experience pretty large negative impacts for at least 2 months after the cyclone. So not only the month of the cyclone, but 2 months after. Inland areas, their impacts are lower, and they only happen during the month of the cyclone. So it seems like inland areas are only impacted by the physical effect of the cyclone. And very strangely, it also seems like these inland areas, they experience a bounce back or rebound effect about 4 and 5 months after the cyclone, and the coastal destinations do not. So, one of the interesting things, at least to us, was this finding on the destination image. The destination image impact appears to be concentrated on waterfront destinations and not so much on the inland destinations. So, what we are trying to bring attention to is, most of our policies that deal with hurricane damage, they are essentially tailored at helping people with this physical impact. But what about this reputation impact that is essentially just as bad and lasts twice as long than the physical impact? What we argue is that perhaps our government should consider some type of assistance for tourism businesses that are experiencing this reputation effect, just like they help people who are suffering through the physical effects of the tropical cyclone. So that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions. I also have my contact information on the screen. Would really love to receive any feedback or if you're interested in reading the paper, please send me a note and I will send you a copy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sergio. There are floor is open to Q&A. You're welcome to post them in Q&A screen. The first question I see raised is, how did you select your independent variables, e.g. unemployment?
Well, so we knew that, there's these big things happening, in the nation that really determine whether people travel to Florida or not. We, sort of thought about different types of indicators. We really tried different things. We found that this unemployment at the state level was a really good predictor. And essentially, when you start including other variables, there's a lot of correlation. So we decided to just keep the unemployment as essentially as our control for macroeconomic issues.
Okay. The next question is from Marcus de Medeiros. Hello, Dr. Alvarez, excellent presentation. Can you explain again, how did you treat seasonality effect? Thank you.
Yes, so great question. So let me go back over here. So the benefit of using panel data is that you have essentially repeated observations on the same unit. In this case, our units are the counties. And we have observations for every month for each one of the 67 counties. So when you run your model as a panel data model, then really your statistical software is using, it knows that all these units of observation, these counties, that they are related in some way. But all these characteristics of the counties, they are not observed. So essentially the model just uses the information from the other counties to trace essentially what would be expected for, say, the county of interest on a particular month and the year. So we also, in addition to this control for the counties, we introduce the time fixed effect, where we control for each specific period in time. So there's an indicator for January of 2009, there's an indicator for February of 2009, March 2009, and all the way until the end of the study in 2018, in December 2018. So just by adding this control, it essentially controls for your seasonality. It accounts for this up and down that you see throughout the year.
Another question is from Taylor Fisher. Was there a significant difference noticed for a storm like Irma that impacted a greater proportion of state?
This is where our, hopefully what we are trying to do is find a data set that will, from the National Weather Service, that has a finer resolution of the intensities so that we can create indicators. This is basically a very simplified indicator. We have, if you get hit by the tropical cyclone in some way, you get a 1. If you don't, you get a 0. But we want to create indicators that control for the intensity. So say a tropical storm will get a 1, hurricane Cat 1 or 2 will get a 2, and a major hurricane will get a 3. And we would see if the impacts differ across intensity levels. Now, unfortunately, the data that we're working with right now doesn't allow us to do that. So to answer the question, we were not able to identify this difference between powerful storms and less powerful storms.
Another question from Dr. Altin. This is an excellent topic. However, intensity of the hurricane varies a lot. For example, some of the storm passed by just brought an inconvenience of the rain, some of the wind. There might be a better idea to develop hurricane intensity effect. For example, hurricane category is divided by distance of the center of hurricane to a country. the coastal versus inland also needs to be controlled because of the surge of water and other issues related to the hurricane.
Yeah, I agree. And you know, again, this question of the data availability. If we don't, you know, let me go back to these maps, for example. So as you can see, whether you're on the left of the eye wall, so the lines are essentially the track of the eye wall. Whether you're on the left or on the right, it really, you know, the wind field is completely different. You know, depending on where you are in comparison to the eye wall, it's, you know, your impacts are going to be different. It's not just distance. It's more complicated than that. So, you know, again, I really think it's a great point. And hopefully over time, as we continue working on this, as we continue finding better and sort of finer data on the cyclones, we will be able to integrate them into our models.
Last question is from Gaurav Pants. When you select the best fit model, was on the base of R-square?
No, it was based on the tests that we performed. So we performed, let me see how many tests. So there's 3 tests. So there was an endogeneity test to help us identify whether we wanted to keep the random effects or the fixed effects model. Then there's a joint time parameters test to help us identify if we should keep the time fixed effects or if we should just go with the counting fixed effects. And then there's a test for heteroscedasticity to identify whether we needed to run the models with robust standard errors or just with normal standard errors.
Excellent. That was the last question. Dr. Alvarez, thank you so much for an excellent presentation today.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Melissa Farboudi. She is a postdoctoral scholar here at Rosen College, UCF. Topic of her presentation is Antecedents of Hotel Employees' Tendency to Help Victims of Human Trafficking. Melissa, floor is yours. Then after her presentation, we will have Q&A just like with Dr. Alvarez, and please type them in the screen Q&A and I will read them out for you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now I'm going to share my screen. And can you see my screen now?
I can see it, so it should be visible.
Okay. Today I'm going to talk about the antecedents of tendency to help victims of human trafficking in the lodging industry. First of all, I would like to thank my advisor, Dr. Taskey, that helped me a lot in this path, and also other faculty members, Dr. Fu, Dr. Rowe, Dr. Samez, and Dr. Morgan. Also, I would like to thank Dr. Cruz for funding this project. This is one of the projects that we've almost finished, and we have another project we are working on. So this is the first step. And so about human trafficking. Human trafficking is the recruitment of people by means of coercion for the purpose of exploitation. It has 2 major categories: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The purpose of sex trafficking is performing commercial sex, and for the labor trafficking, the purpose is to perform labor or services through the use of force. According to the International Labour Organization, in 2016, about 40 million people were the victims of human trafficking. And out of these 40 million people, about 25 million were in labor and sex trafficking, and the rest was forced marriage. And among those who were victims of labor and sex trafficking, 75% of them were women and girls. So according to some studies, human trafficking is one of the fastest growing crime in the world, and it's a business with 150 billion US dollar annual profit. There is a misconception that human trafficking happens mostly in developing countries. However, it happens in developed countries. For example, in the US, about $47 billion is the annual profit of the human trafficking. Also, human trafficking happens in different businesses, especially the businesses that have public access, such as the hospitality industry and the lodging industry. According to the US National Human Trafficking Hotline, the top venues for sex trafficking are resident-based commercial sex buildings, massage and spa businesses, and hotels and motels. And also, the top venues for the labor trafficking are construction, agriculture, domestic servitude, traveling sales agents, and restaurants. As these statistics and report shows, human hospitality industry and the lodging industry has an important role in the human trafficking. So it's a common problem in this industry. Although human trafficking is a prevalent issue, the research on human trafficking is scarce. There are some research by governmental agencies which majorly focused on the needs and experiences of sex trafficking victims. We have a few academic research limited mainly to the legal aspect of human trafficking. And in the context of tourism and hospitality, we have a few conceptual paper and qualitative paper that try to study the relationship between sex tourism and human trafficking. So as we see, there is a big lack of research on human trafficking, particularly in the hospitality and tourism context. That's why we decided to focus on this topic in the lodging industry, and our research aimed to examine the antecedents of hotel employees' helping behavior towards victims of human trafficking. As I said, the lodging industry is one of the top venues of sex trafficking because it has suitable conditions for transient populations. It provides a degree of privacy and anonymity for both traffickers and victims, and also it provides demand through hotel guests, particularly during major events such as sports events. And that's why we chose the lodging industry as the context of this study. And the reason that we focus on hotel employees is that by March 2020, the lodging industry had more than 2 million employees in the US. And most of these employees have direct contact with customers. And they are typically the first people who see or hear about or experience incidents at the workplace. So making hotel employees aware of the trafficking issue in the lodging industry is the first critical step to identify and combat trafficking, human trafficking. So that's why we chose the hotel employees as our focus. But we thought that just raising awareness about human trafficking among employees is not enough. So we should go further, because just providing information and making someone aware of a phenomenon such as a human trafficking does not necessarily affect their perception of that phenomenon and does not necessarily lead to behavioral intentions and actual behavior. So there was a need to address the human trafficking beyond raising awareness, and we decided to focus on helping behavior. Helping behavior is a voluntary behavior aiming at benefiting another purpose. And researchers, particular researchers in the psychology field of study, started studying helping behavior after a real incident in 1964. In 1964, a lady named Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death outside of her apartment. This incident was not a quick incident. It took about 30 minutes. She was fighting back with the person who attacked her, and she was screaming, and there were 38 neighbors and bystanders there who saw or even heard her, but they didn't assist and they didn't even call the police. So the researchers wondered why people saw and heard this incident, but nobody involved and nobody helped. So they started identifying the factors that induce or hinders helping behavior in different incidents. Again, we had another incident in 2010 in New York. A guy was stabbed to death in the street, and 20 people passed his wounded body without helping him. So again, research on helping behavior was done on different incidents, especially violence. However, human trafficking is a costly and dangerous situation. Usually it is hidden. So research on helping behavior in these situations when an incident is hidden is very scarce. So we decided to focus on employees helping behavior, which is beyond raising awareness, and it can lead to a major action to help victims identified at workplace. In the context of helping behavior, we have two competing schools of thought that explain helping behavior: altruism and egoism. In the altruism school of thought, human actions, especially helping behavior, is motivated out of consideration of the victim's needs and concerns. However, the people who believe in egoism school of thought, they believe that most human actions, or I can say all human actions, including helping behavior, is driven by selfish desires and self-benefit. So there is no helping other considering that person's concerns and needs. Different scholars and different researchers developed models and hypotheses in both schools of thought. The major hypothesis in the altruism school of thought is empathy altruistic hypothesis. As you see here, based upon the altruism school of thought, empathy is the major driver of helping behavior, which is measured by three constructs of emotional arousal, perspective taking, and sympathy. Emotional arousal in the context of the human trafficking in the lodging industry, it means employees emotional arousal and personal distress when they perceive or see another person as a victim, another person in need. Perspective taking, it means employees' ability to take the perspective of the perspectives of victims by placing themselves in the victim's place and or by imagining the victim's painful experiences. And finally, sympathy is employees' feelings of warmth and compassion towards the victims. On the other hand, we have the egoism school of thought. In the egoism school of thought, as we said, self-benefit is the major driver of helping behavior. Thus, people assess the costs and rewards of helping when they want to help another person. And if the rewards outweigh the cost of helping, they intend to help that person. Both schools of thought have been studied separately from each other, but based on recent neuroscience studies, they figured, the neuroscience scholars figured out that both schools of thought have a shared component, a shared starting point, which is emotional arousal. No matter if you want to help another person out of altruism or for self-benefit, you need to be emotionally aroused, personally distressed by perceiving that person in need in order to take action to help or not. So because these two schools of thought have a shared component, a shared starting point, we decided for the first time to integrate these schools of thought in our study to see if both of them at the same time can explain helping behavior, or no, if one of them in the context of human trafficking can dominate the other one. So we developed a conceptual framework in which our dependent variable is tendency to help. Helping in the context of the human trafficking can occur through direct methods and indirect methods. Direct methods, for example, an employee perceives that one of the customers is the victim of human trafficking, and he decides to call her room or his room, or goes to the room and asks the person if he or she needs help. This is a direct method. But indirect methods involves calling the police or contacting help hotlines in order to help the victim indirectly. So our dependent variables is the tendency to help. As I said, we integrated altruism school of thought and egoism school of thought. Altruistic factors, I mentioned emotional arousal, perspective taking, and sympathy, and the egoistic factors were perceived cost of helping and perceived reward of helping. And we took one step backward to see if we have any factors that may affect both altruistic and egoistic factors. And we came up with three major factors. Employees' informational familiarity with the human trafficking issue is one of the factors that becomes included in our model. Employees' perceived vulnerability of the larger industry to human trafficking, which means some employees may know about human trafficking issue, but they may not have any idea that human trafficking incidents may happen at their workplace. And otherness. Otherness means employees perceive difference between themselves and the victims, considering different factors, for example, socio-demographic factors. And usually when there is an otherness, a high level of otherness in someone, for example, I perceive myself as an employee different from a customer or victims regarding different factors, for example, social status, and it creates a sense of superiority in me. When there is a high level of otherness in me as an employee, it decreases, so we hypothesize that otherness decreases altruism, increases egoism, and decreases tendency to help. However, familiarity with the human trafficking issue and perceived vulnerability, both of them can help employees increase their altruism, decrease their egoism, and finally increase their tendency to help. So the detailed model of this conceptual framework is here. We had a lot of hypotheses. We had about 10 constructs, a lot of hypotheses. Each of the hypotheses was supported by a theory or a model that we had in previous literature. We integrated the literature from psychology, sociology, management, and different theories, and we came up with this model. And we have the gender as a moderator in this model, and we have the control variables of race and social desirability. Social desirability because helping behavior is a very social desirable behavior in the society, so we consider that as our control variable. I'm not going into the details of all these hypotheses because it takes a lot of time. We test our model through survey, and our population was US hotel employees. We focused on the employees who have direct contact with guests. So we focused on front office employees and housekeeping employees, and we screened them through screening questions. And the survey instrument was built based on the previous literature from psychology and sociology, but we refined and we contextualized the survey in our pilot study. We conducted a pilot study. We collected about 800 surveys, out of which 569 valid surveys were obtained, and we did exploratory factor analysis, and the results were all good. And for the main study, again, we conducted 800 surveys, and we obtained 524 valid surveys. We didn't have any missing data because all respondents were required to answer all the questions. Regarding the results, I'll start with the demographics. So the mean of our age was 33 years old. We had a surprising result in terms of the gender. about 70% of our respondents were male, and about just 30% of our respondents were female, and I will explain later how we consider the effects of this unequal sample size in our study. And in terms of the, we ask about their education, marital status. However, in terms of their workplaces, most of them were working at chain hotels, for example, Hilton, Marriott. And in terms of their employment status, most of them were full-time. And in terms of their position, most of them were at supervisor and management level position. So when we saw that most of our participants are management and supervisor level positions, we concluded that so it is reasonable to have more male participants, because in the hospitality industry, supervisor management level people usually are men. Also, another possible reason for the higher number of male participants is that we collected this data at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. It was a time that most of the workplaces were closed. A lot of people were furloughed. So we suppose that most of maybe we had a lot of people at home working from home, or who were furloughed, a lot of men. So, and they decided to participate in our study. However, we did multi-group analysis in order to find out if there is any significant difference between men and women regarding our hypotheses. And out of the 30 hypotheses, we had just 5 hypotheses that there were a significant difference between men and women. So those 5 hypotheses might be affected by the higher number of men in this study. But the other hypothesis, no, this unequal sample size didn't have any effect on them. Also, for the common method variance check, we did a lot of different tests in order to control and also identify the common method variance. So the first test was Harman single factor test, which didn't show any common method bias, but we did a most rigorous and strict test during our CFA, which showed we have a common method bias. So we included a common method factor in our CFA model in order to explain the variance shared by the common method factor. Regarding the CFA results, most of the results were okay, were good. Most of the factor loadings were above 0.7, and also we didn't have any convergent or discriminant validity issues. We didn't have any reliability issues. The measurement model fit, we had a goodness of fit regarding the standards, and also regarding the structural model fit, we had a goodness of fit as well. So this is the structural model results. As you see, some of the hypotheses were supported, some of the hypotheses were not supported. I showed them in this figure. The solid lines showed the supported hypothesis, and the dotted lines shows the unsupported hypothesis. For the unsupported hypothesis, we had some explanation, but the 2 major explanations I'm going to talk about here is about the construct of otherness, which I told you is the perceived difference between employees and the victims, and the construct of perspective taking. Otherness, we included otherness here as a unidimensional construct, but however, otherness has 2 types. We have positive otherness and negative otherness. Positive otherness means that when I perceive myself different from other people, it creates a sense of self-identification in me, and it creates a sense of self-confidence in me. However, negative otherness, it means that when I perceive myself different from other people, it may create a sense of superiority in me and a sense of humiliation for others. So unfortunately, we didn't consider these 2 types of otherness in our studies. So most of the hypotheses related to the construct of awareness were not supported. So in future research, we're going to consider that, and it is recommended that other scholars consider it too. And also regarding the perspective taking, as I told you, it means that employees put themselves in the place of victims or imagine the victims' experiences. So again, we have two types of perspective taking: putting oneself in imagine self, which is called imagine self, putting oneself in someone's shoe, or imagining, so imagine other, imagining someone else's experiences. So also we didn't consider these two types. Sorry, we had a Q&A question. We didn't consider these two types of perspective taking, and so some of the hypotheses related to the perspective taking were not supported. However, in summary, the supported hypothesis shows that in our study, the major driver of tendency to help the victims of human trafficking in the larger industry is sympathy and perspective taking. So we showed that the altruism school of thought is dominant in costly situations such as human trafficking, and egoism school of thought didn't have any role in our context, in our study. Also, the major driver of both of these were perceived vulnerability of the lodging industry. So the more employees perceive that the lodging industry is vulnerable to human trafficking, they showed more sympathy and they were more able to take the perspectives of human trafficking victims. And also the familiarity with human trafficking had an effect on perspective. The more employees were aware of human trafficking, had more information about human trafficking, they were more able to take the perspective of the human trafficking. Regarding the control variable, social desirability, as I said, it was a control variable and showed significant negative effect on our egoistic factors and positive effect on our altruistic factors. Regarding the race, only American Indian and Alaska Natives showed a greater level of tendency to indirectly help victims of human trafficking. And also the reason for that, the possible reason for that is that about 40% of the women involved in sex trafficking in the US and Canada were identified as American Indian Alaska Natives. So it may be the possible reason that employees with this race showed a greater level of tendency. In terms of the multi-group analysis, as I said, just 5 hypotheses, there was a significant difference between men and women, the effect of otherness on emotional arousal and perceived vulnerability, the effect of vulnerability on perceived cost of helping, and emotional arousal and help directly, and perspective taking and sympathy. So these 5 hypotheses may be affected by the higher number of male participants in our studies. So in summary, the theoretical implications of the studies, we contributed to the literature of human trafficking by taking an anti-trafficking approach and focusing on hotel employees, and we provided a new perspective on helping behavior by integrating altruism and egoism school of thought. And we expanded the organizational behavior literature by investigating the factors that influence helping behavior towards a vulnerable population at work. And also we revealed that altruism is the dominant factor in determining helping behavior in the human trafficking context in the lodging industry. In terms of the practical implications, since altruism was the major factor employees helping behavior, we recommend that hotel practitioners provide educational programs that can sharpen employees' perspective taking ability and increase their sympathy. For example, prior research showed that mindfulness techniques can help with the increase of employees' sympathy, and also including psychoeducational programs for employees to increase their sense of belonging and inclusiveness is recommended. Sense of belonging and inclusiveness is not only help employees to identify and help victims in the context of human trafficking in any type of crisis. When it happens, when we have employees with high level of belonging and inclusiveness, their performance, their cooperation might be better. Also, training to increase employees' knowledge about the human trafficking issue, the places that human trafficking happens, through educational courses and workshops is recommended. Joining anti-trafficking campaigns will be good for the hotel practitioners and the hotels and motels. Also, having a protocol for reporting human trafficking incidents is highly recommended, because most of the hotel employees, they may know about human trafficking, they may know that human trafficking may happen at their workplace, but they don't know how to react and how to report this incident. So developing a protocol for reporting human trafficking incidents is good. Also, security measures and including human trafficking prevention as one of the corporate social responsibility goals are recommended for the hotels and motels. And finally, cause marketing or cause-related marketing plans for businesses that combat human trafficking is going to help them in terms of their perceived image. This study was not free from limitations. Unequal gender sample size, although we controlled that and we identified the hypotheses that might be affected by it, but for future studies, good to have equal gender sample sizes. And also the presence of the common method bias due to the socially desirable context of this study is one of the limitations of this study. And for the future studies, in-person data collection from hotel employees, especially the hotels, the non-chain hotels, and also studies across different cultures, different types of studies, for example, experimental designs, qualitative studies, are all recommended. And last but not least, human trafficking is an interdisciplinary topic. As I mentioned earlier, we integrated different literatures from sociology and psychology and management in order to conduct this study. But there are a lot of opportunities for interdisciplinary cooperation, not only sociology, psychology. We can have scholars from legal studies and computer science, considering that most of the recruitment for victims, human trafficking victims, is conducted online. It's good to have computer science scholars for these types of research. And thank you. I conclude my presentation here. And any questions?
Thank you so much, Melissa, for the great presentation. Now floor is open for Q&A. You see that Q&A is a little icon on the bottom. Feel free to type your question. The first two questions you have from Manuel Vanegas. One is, could you enhance your description about connectivity with the tourism and travel industry? And the second question from the same person is, remember that service is the key for lodging industry. Why an employee should get involved?
Sure, as I mentioned earlier, why the connectivity for tourism and travel industry. There are a few research and papers on the connection of the sex tourism and human trafficking. But here we just focus on the lodging industry because for different years, consequently, the human trafficking hotline reported that hotels and motels are one of the top 3 venues of human trafficking. That's the relationship between the the lodging industry and the human trafficking, and also the lodging, the travel and tourism industry, because most of them have access, have public access. Transient population, especially hotels, they provide anonymity for the guests, for both traffickers and victims. They are considered appropriate places, anonymous places for human trafficking. They are like the target of traffickers, and that's the other connection between the travel and tourism and the human trafficking. And why employee? Because as I said, employees are usually the first people. Usually they have direct contact with guests, and usually they are the first people who hear about or who see or perceive an incident. So that's why we decided to focus on employee. And when they see an incident, first of all, they should know about it, they should have knowledge about it, and also they should know how to react.
One more question is, interesting presentation topic, Melissa. What were you challenging for collecting suitable data?
The challenges, as I said, is I didn't expect that I have a lot of male participants, but the challenge was that it was during the COVID-19, and also when we collected data, we saw that we have a lot of male participants, but we didn't want to, because we have 2 rounds of data collection, both for pilot study and the main study, and both of them, when I checked the demography, in both of them, the male participants was dominant. So I didn't see any point to do another round of data collection. And another challenge was to find employees who typically have direct contacts with the guests. So we focus on the housekeeping and also the front office. So we had the screening questions and we tried to be strict with the participants' answers.
That was the last question so far I have from Q&A. Is there any more questions? We have about 10 minutes.
I think we have another one. Oh, yes, it's the same.
Same question.
Okay.
Any more questions? Excellent. Melissa, thank you so much for this excellent research and presenting today during Colloquium. We are concluding this presentation for today, and we will see you in the next Colloquium. Thank you very much.
Thank you.